Stop.
This is our third session of the Hescale seminar, and we are very happy to have Jonathan Haynes, who is a professor at Long Island University. Before we start, I would like to thank the IUT Robert Schumann. It's thanks to the equipment and the facility that we can have this digital seminar. I would like to thank as well the Café Pédagogique and the students in the licence professionnelle Stratégie de la communication et de l'information numérique, en particulier Koku Kosivi, qui gère la session de ce soir, Arthur Scholler et Martine Metz. Et maintenant, I will be introducing Jonathan Haynes. As I said earlier, he's a professor at Long Island University, defines himself as a Marxist critic. He is the author of Nollywood, The Creation of Nigerian Film Genres, that was published in 2016. He has also co-edited Cinema and Social Change in West Africa, and he has edited Nigerian video films. Jonathan Haynes is a specialist of Nollywood and the Nigerian film industry. And we are very happy to have him with us today. And as I said earlier, thank you very much, Jonathan, for your presentation. That was really stimulating and really interesting. So I would like to start with a question. You emphasize the diversity of the Nigerian film industry and to a certain extent deplore the kind of homogenizing Nollywood term and the ways in which it hides a very, very different types of film production. Are the differences in the Nigerian film production primarily cultural, linguistic, economic, or related to urban development or the absence of it? And is there still a region in Nigeria that you could still qualify as a popular grassroots production? You talk a lot, for instance, in your presentation about Asaba, but
that's right.
There might be other regions.
Okay. Yeah. First, let me say it's a real pleasure to be with you, even in this virtual manner. I wish we were going out to dinner afterwards, but anyway, this is good. Yeah, Nollywood, one of the most consequential things about Nollywood is that it kind of demonstrated the principle that Africans can make movies, even Africans with very little money and very little professional training, very little access to the centers of power. This kind of grassroots filmmaking started in Lagos. I mean, actually, the Ghanaians got there a little bit earlier. But if it started in Lagos, it then spread. I mean, people say actually in Kano they were also making this kind of film earlier, slightly earlier in northern Nigeria. So from beginning, there's always been really three separate industries in Nigeria. The one we call Nollywood that makes films mostly in English, but also a Hausa language one based in the north, a Yoruba language one based in several cities in southwestern Nigeria. It's not all in one place. And then in the east, I follow a common usage in talking about Asaba films. That's the name of a a city where many films are shot. They tend to be financed from Onitsha, another Igbo city across the river, across the Niger River. But Enugu is also important, and Benin City in Nigeria, and they're making films in the Bini language, and so on and so forth. So this dispersal of production is never going to go away, because people are always going to want to see films, that are very close to their own lives in the language they speak. And so on. So that kind of diversity, I think, is never going to go away. I think, like a lot of other Westerners, my initial interest in African filmmaking came out of a general interest in third world filmmaking, as we used to call it. And I and a lot of others got to that out of a third worldist politics, a sense that Western imperialism and colonialism were really bad things, and that we wanted to sort of support those who were opposed to that, and to do work that signaled that opposition alternatives. So that kind of underlies my initial interest in this grassroots, popular cultural form of filmmaking. And in this latest development, which I talked about in my recorded presentation, it much of that was about the intervention of capitalist corporations into this industry, which was formulated on a basis which was not in many have the basic structures of transparency and accumulation don't we associate with capitalism. Be a renewed danger that the Nigerian film culture, global capitalism and cultural imperialism, and
It looks like we are losing Jonathan
that's
Haynes.
still an issue. But I've been sort of, reassured by the. Really? Am I there? I can still see you.
Yes, it looks like we have
Can
got
you hear
problems with your connection. Vincent, whom I forgot to introduce, and I want to apologize to you.
No
Vincent Bouchard is the co-organizer and the moderator of this session with me. Thank you, Vincent, for being with us. It looks
Thank
like
you,
we have a
Patricia.
problem. It looks like we have a problem with the connection. Jonathan's connection is very shaky.
We miss only the end
do you
of
have the same?
your answer, Jonathan. If you could come back a little and maybe, because it seems to be stabilized now.
Okay. Yeah. I was saying that,
Sorry.
in the last since about 2013, there's been a very dramatic intervention of kind of transnational capitalism or formal capitalism. A lot of that the capital is Nigerian, but into this film industry, and that's a new thing, and that led to renewed concern about cultural imperialism and about Nigerian media culture being taken over by some kind of.
Oops. I think we lost you again, Jonathan.
Are you there?
John? Oops. I can take over Patricia, but not that's not possible.
It looks like. Are you back?
I mean, I'm still getting. I can see you. Can you see me? Sorry about this.
Can you, because we didn't hear the end of what you were saying, it looks like.
If you want, I can try to summarize and go on another question linked with what you were saying. And that's something I really appreciate in your work, and specifically in your presentation. You are creating links between different strikes, different elements between the technical mediums, the fact they are making videos or film, the distribution, the TV networks. And even if there is different form of production, and you presented different form of production, there is still a link between all these different Hollywood, between the old Hollywood, the new Hollywood, as a grassroots Hollywood, etc., etc. There is still something in common. And what I like very much with your approach is the link between the economical aspects, the aesthetical aspects, the question of audience, and you try to describe the entire system, and that's something very valuable. I have a very specific question about the new Hollywood, so the Hollywood, the Nollywood link with the TV networks, the new form of digital production with maybe more means of production, more expertise, but I'm guessing also more control, both legal and both coming from the producer. And you spoke about the impact of the cinema theater on the selection, on the validation of the film production. Could you come back a little bit on that and explain the link? Because I think that's a very important aspect of this new Hollywood. I know you're not very, and I share it's a problem of characterizing this type of production, but there is a difference between the video production and the digitally broadcasted production. So, and cinema theater could be one of the aspects. So.
That's right. I mean, in general, in the big picture, what I keep hearing from people in various parts of the industry is content is king. The most important thing in this situation is the connection between filmmakers and the audience. And everyone is scrambling to figure out how to get the films in front of audiences, and of course, how to monetize it. But that relationship is key. And that means that, I think in general, the media, the people running the media platforms are going to ensure that the Nigerian audience gets to see what they want to see. And they want to see different things because the audience is very diverse. And so the system as a whole will continue to cater to that diversity. But what's going on in the cinema theaters is the exception to that rule, because there are very few of these new multiplex cinemas. They are almost all in kind of relatively fancy shopping malls in the more affluent neighborhoods. And they cater to a specific demographic, young people, again, who are much more affluent than the generality of the population. So the people who program those cinemas are very cautious about only programming films that they're pretty sure will appeal to that demographic. But the decisions they take are consequential beyond the movie theaters, because to get a budget for a relatively large budget, we're still not talking about very much money. But you know, the low end budgets in Nigeria are $10,000 or even less. So if you want to make a film for much more than that amount of money, you have to convince the investors that the people who make decisions about the cinema, what gets programmed in cinemas, will agree that this is a film that will sell in the cinemas. So you've got this kind of this corner of a very large industry which serves a very particular and elite audience, you know, sort of having a disproportionate influence. I think this is a temporary situation, but you know, it's important at this moment.
Have these multiplexes been doing well?
Everyone likes to complain, and people think they are. Filmmakers all believe that and resent them for it. If you talk to these people, they will tell you they're in a very hard business. The devaluation of the currency, of the naira, in the recession from, when was that, 2015, 2016, they're gradually emerging from this recession after a long period of boom. But the currency really fell. So somebody, you know, an important person in the world of the cinemas told me they really want to be expanding into community cinemas that serve a popular audience, where a ticket costs the same as a bottle of beer, you know, that way beyond their current elite audience. The people who run this business understand that's where the money is. But in 2012, when this company started opening theaters, it costs about $100,000 to equip a cinema theater. And now it takes 3 times as many naira to buy that equipment. They can't triple the ticket prices because the market just can't stand that. So there are ways in which the you know, this downturn in the general economy, and in particular in the rate of inflation in the currency, has had a huge effect on them, and they feel that they're operating, you know, kind of on a shoestring also. You know, they yeah. But as I say, they are making money. It's probably the satellite broadcaster DSTV, which is part of a South African conglomerate. I think those are the people who are making the serious money, but they're not talking. It's very hard to find out how much, you know, they actually make.
And you were saying you were talking about the ways in which the screening of the films in the cinemas. I mean, obviously, it was. I mean, tickets were expensive, so they target as very specific, wealthier audiences.
Yeah.
What are the ways in which the films that cater to these audiences, right? What's the specificity of these films, and how does it redefine the range of films that could be produced?
Yeah, class consolidation is really going on in Nigeria, and a cultural consolidation along with that, for various reasons. I mean, colonialism tended to suppress the development of an African bourgeoisie, you know, a capitalist class. And then the years since independence have been so volatile, and that also kind of inhibited the consolidation of classes as a European would understand them. But it's happening now. And so the films made for the multiplexes and many others, it's not just them, but you get a lot of films now set in a world of young urban professionals. There's a glamorization of the culture of business, of working for a corporation and or a startup company, a tech firm. You're always under pressure and so on and so forth. You work late on your laptop with a bottle of good white wine next to your, and you're having a romance with your coworker. That kind of story, which is pretty far from the lives of, again, 2/3 of the Nigerian population lives on $2 a day or less. It's a very poor country, and half of it is still rural. And, this is a quite distinct world from the one they live in. The original Nollywood, made films about people with money. I mean, it was always aspirational, as people say. Poor people don't necessarily enjoy watching images of poor people. They know that. They'd rather watch somebody with a fancy car and a fancy cell phone and a fancy house. But the perspective on wealth at first was extremely critical. These were films about wealthy people, but they spoke to people who were not wealthy. And so the changes, these new films are by people who kind of live in this quite modern, quite secular, right? In these films, the supernatural almost never appears, and that was one of the trademarks of Nollywood originally. So, this is what I mean by class consolidation, in the film world. The people watching the films are very much like the people in the films, who are pretty much like the people making the films. That was not how it used to be.
That's excellent, and it's linked with another aspect I would like to discuss now. You spoke about the different public and the different way to address public, and there is two issues from that. One aspect is the economical aspect. If you want to have success, if you want to make money, you need a public. And you spoke about different politics to aggregate segmented publics, and I think that's
yes.
a very good approach, because more public you have, more chance you have to get money from your production. But at the same time, there is a strong political aspect. You spoke about the first cinema, all the content, all the type of representation sent to different type of public. And in your presentation, you spoke about the one aspect of the grassroots production and the question of authenticity. The fact a form of production is close to a specific public. So how this two opposite, two contradiction are working, and of course there is no one answer, because there is different strategy depending of the type of Nollywood we are speaking about. But how to reconcile to being close to the public, to appeal to a specific public, and to address this great diversity of publics. How do you figure that? How do you conceptualize this relation between this apparent contradiction?
Yeah, I mean, authenticity is actually a term I try to avoid, because it's so, loaded up.
Let's speak about realness.
Yeah, right. And yes, realism is kind of close to my heart, and that's something that I personally want to see in films. Nollywood often does not give it to me, but yeah, I mean, again, the audience is very segmented, if you like, or diverse. Nollywood, one of its great accomplishments is it did really assemble a national audience and establish a film culture which is important in itself. I mean, the relative autonomy of art is a phrase Marxists, use for this. But it's that film culture is elastic, and it's something that most of the parts of this very diverse field have in common. And so it's still possible for films to cross over. In fact, the way the economics of the industry work, you have to play across platforms. I mean, at the low end, there's still films that are straight to video discs, and that's all they ever do. But most of the films, certainly coming out of Lagos, are aimed at, they need to work across platforms. So I don't know if I'm answering your yeah.
Thank you.
Going back to the issue of languages, I mean, you talked about the ways in which you've got films that are shot in different languages, but do these films circulate to other regions? What are the languages that are being used? What are the what's at work in the use of different languages? Or is each language limited to a specific region, with the films basically not circulating beyond that? Because I read somewhere in the past that there was a greater use of English, right, in order to have films that can circulate much more widely. So what about the other languages? What can you say about the films that are shot in other languages? What about their circulation?
Yeah, I don't pretend to exact knowledge of most of that situation, but the house of film industry, is a very large one. And something like 50 million people speak Hausa. Many of them are not Hausa, but it's the lingua franca for northern Nigeria. And those films also spread beyond Nigeria to the Republic of Niger and to other countries. So, but they hardly penetrate southern Nigeria. There are a few actors who cross over, a few directors who cross over, but really not much. The Yoruba industry has always been much closer to Nollywood, to the English language production. They still have their own separate professional organizations and structures. But Yoruba films are very popular. There was an essay by Hyginus Kwasi in the Journal of African Cinemas a few years ago about actually the MultiChoice, Mnet, this South African corporation sponsored a research project on the reception of its broadcasts. And the most interesting finding of that study, which I remember, is that many people were watching Yoruba films who were not Yoruba. They're subtitled. And, as you're channel surfing, there are now 8 Africa Magic channels, one in Igbo, one in Yoruba, several in English. You can also, in Nigeria, at least if you get the premium package, there are also films in Swahili. and other languages as well. So I was surprised at the extent to which non-Yorubas thought the Yoruba films were just more interesting than anything else. And I have a lot of friends, non-Yoruba friends, who agree with that. I sort of agree with it. So there is quite a bit of crossover. There's also something, I mean, even as people talk about the tremendous rate of culture loss that's going on in Nigeria and elsewhere, that there are a lot of Yoruba, people who concern themselves with Yoruba culture are extremely distressed at the fact that Nigerian languages have become an optional subject in the school system, which means most people don't study them. And many parents now are not really teaching their mother tongues to their children, because English is the language of success, as Moradewin Adejumobi wrote years ago in a very important essay about the language, why English was kind of predominating in Hollywood films. But what's happening now is Pidgin, which is the lingua franca, the unofficial lingua franca, especially for southern Nigeria. You find it less in the north, but it's a very powerful thing. And it's kind of taken over Nigerian popular culture to an amazing degree. It's really grown. Stand-up comedy, for instance, which has become a major form, or hip hop music, Afro beats, that the most popular forms of music now are mostly in Pidgin. So again, Pidgin's got a prominence that it didn't have 20 years ago, when many people looked down on it. So even as people are losing the sort of connections to the depths of their culture, they're still asserting their pride in being Nigerian through the use of Pidgin. And even the films, one of the researches I did when I was in Lagos a couple of months ago was to go to Film One, which is the biggest distribution company to theaters in Nigeria. And they also produce films. They put money, they sponsor films. And the people there had a very exact idea of the culture, which meant the linguistic culture, but also the cultural framework of every single individual theater in the country. There's still few enough of them that you can do that. But when they talked about sponsoring a film or programming a film, everyone is conscious of the politics of, okay, it will be in English. The main character is going to be Yoruba, but we want a secondary character who comes from, another ethnic group. You want as many ethnic groups as possible represented. And so even in those films, which are targeted to this elite audience, programmatically, you get a whole lot of code switching, certainly to Pidgin, but often, even usually to other Nigerian audiences. There'll be a bit of Igbo, there'll be a bit of Yoruba, so everyone can identify with this product. This is, it's become newly prominent, I think, in film production, but it's also one of the ways in which Nollywood is indebted to the heritage of the Nigerian Television Authority, which was tremendously important in establishing a media culture for Nigeria. And it was really on television that this multilinguistic, but specifically Nigerian kind of linguistic soup was created. This formula where, yes, it's mostly in English, but Pidgin gets in bits of many languages, so that people from all over the country can feel like they're included, they're being spoken to, at least to some extent. Some gesture is being made towards them.
The influence of the Nigerian culture, the Nigerian model, and all the different Nollywood on West Africa and all over Africa is very obvious. And what you just described between the ethnic or linguistic boundaries is also religious boundaries. For example, more Hausa film distributed in North Ghana and more Yoruba film distributed in South Ghana, things like that. And there is also a very interesting research by Matthias Krings about the reception of Yoruba film in Tanzania by non-Yoruba speaker, and all the difficulties. So maybe you know about that. That's, I would like to broaden the discussion about the influence of the Nigerian model, the Nigerian cultural model, and you spoke about the question of popular culture. There is an expression of popular culture through your research, through the examination, the close examination of Nollywood films in general, different model you describe. So how could you modelize, how could you help us to modelize the concept of popular culture? Of course, that's a concept coming from abroad, from the US, from a different reality, from different elements, and we need to adapt it to our research in West Africa on a very specific history. The tradition is not the same, the media is not the same, the relation to people, to media are not the same. And there is a very, very interesting essay you quote in your presentation from Karen Berber about popular culture. So what's your position about the term, the relation to elite culture, to traditional culture, and popular culture? How do you figure all of that? And of course, I don't expect a full answer, but maybe some elements, some thought about the very large topic.
Yeah. I mean, that essay by Karen Barber, The Popular Arts in Africa, from 1987, had an enormous influence on me. And in an essay I wrote with Anua Akome, which was really the first essay that was exclusively about the Nigerian video film phenomenon, and trying to create some kind of framework within which to discuss it, since it was so different from what people knew as African cinema in those days. I mean, I still think Barber kind of nailed it. It wasn't just her. Bioden Jafo and Johannes Fabian and others also helped to build that concept. She was summarizing a whole body of work, not just inventing things on her own. But so, in that conception, the African popular arts, they're different from the mass culture, which the Frankfurt School and other European and American critics denounced as a way for capitalism to brainwash the masses. So that was a corporate products. Soap operas, I mean, they were created by companies that sold soap, and were dropped on all over the world as a way of kind of training people to be capitalist consumers. All right, so the African popular arts are something different. They come from the grassroots. They require very little capital and very little formal training. So celluloid cinema couldn't be made on this basis, really, but video allowed for this, or very ordinary people could get their hands on a camcorder, a cheap video camera and shoot a film with their friends and video,
Oops.
and so on. Suddenly, almost anybody could make a movie. But so video films built on this model based on the informal sector of the economy. Again, very cheap turnaround. These are a class of objects made by very much like their audience, which is the heterogeneous kind of masses of African cities in particular. Those cities are themselves in a place where the hinterland of the country, cultural and otherwise, meets imports from abroad and combines them in novel ways. So all kinds of musical forms, or those paintings of a bar in Mali, Togo, or Zimbabwe, or anywhere in Africa. These are all examples of this class of art forms, and I still think that model works for the original Nollywood, which is still flourishing. It's still at least half of what's going on in Nigeria. And it's still the more workable model for these smaller local industries, right? That don't have access to satellite broadcasting, or, the people who run internet companies are not looking for them. But the revision that's necessary now, I feel, in our critical apparatus is just, there's this other thing going on now also, where properly capitalist corporations are getting into the picture. Again, they're there to make money, and for many of them, the aggregation of existing audiences is what will make them money. But they are also, we do see a mass cultural kind of product being manufactured now, where you do have corporations trying to come up with a standardized product that will sell to a lot of people. And so, we need to learn or relearn how to talk about that kind of art form, and to just observe the boundary. I keep referring to this book by Ramon Labato and Julian Thomas, The Informal Media Economy. They do an excellent job of taking examples from all over the world of media environments. It's basically every media environment where you have both a formal sector and an informal sector. And they interact in all kinds of ways. Everywhere that relationship keeps changing. It's not a steady, stable thing. It evolves from one form to another. That's a very important model, I think, for what we need to do in order to have a sense of the totality of the media environments now. I quote. Now I'm losing his name. Jörg Weitz or something has. I've in the last couple of things I've written, I've quoted this guy who's got a very polemical line on how many African cities now are full of the phenomena of late capitalism, that are perfectly familiar to anyone who lives in an advanced capitalist country. So it's everything from Uber to health clubs to precarious employment to the whole gig economy. And Facebook, and so on and so forth. That's really in Lagos and in many other places in Nigeria. So that kind of globalized capitalist culture is really in Africa. And this guy's point, I did refer to him in my recorded thing, is that African studies as a discipline has been pretty bad at coming to grips with this, or at least he notices the word capitalism almost never comes up in North America and Europe when people are talking about this. I think he's exaggerating this to some extent, but still, he's saying something that's very, very much worth thinking about. We have to, have a critical apparatus which does justice to the complexity of this situation.
Yeah, thank you.
Are you referring to framing the shots?
No, it's the other. Yeah, I could look it up, but I have
I looked up the. I couldn't find any. I found the title "Framing the Shots" because you referred to it, and it seemed also an interesting reference.
Yeah, that's a very different document. That's basically inviting transnational capitalism into investing in the Nigerian and more broadly the African market for cinemas, because that's also a very interesting document, and filled with sort of facts and figures supporting the claim that Africa is the last underdeveloped market for cinema theaters. And the world has noticed that and wants to make money off of it. So I think we are going to see, and soon, an enormous expansion of that stuff. And it's really hard to convey how quickly things are changing and how many new platforms are sort of jostling for attention here. One thing that I'm not sure I mentioned at all in my recorded thing is that the UN mandated that television broadcasting, terrestrial broadcasting across the world transition from analog to digital. This is supposed to have already happened, but Nigeria has been missing deadlines for getting this done. But it's happened across about half the country, and now in places, and it's state by state in Nigeria, but places that used to have 3 terrestrial television stations now have 15. They need content. They really need content. So again, there's a whole lot of work available to people who make content, although, as I pointed out, it's mostly badly paid just because these platforms need a lot of content, and they're competing for customers, and their customers don't have much money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See that. It looks like we have lost Jonathan one more time.
Am I still with you?
Yes.
You're back.
You're back with us.
Yeah, you blacked out for a second. But okay, good. Lots of work, but badly paid. A lot of people told me, actually, they told me that people don't like to talk about this, but they were making more money in the old, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, from the old disc, the market for discs. Yeah.
And it was not a very profitable market.
But that's, I've been. Yeah. And I mean, new Nollywood, we were so excited 10 years ago, more or less, when that term began to be used for these more ambitious Nigerian films that were made possible by these multiplex cinema theaters, but it was enough more that they could have higher budgets and make a film that could go to international film festivals and so on. So, and Kunle Afolayan, who was kind of the flag bearer for that, and an enormously talented director, and there were a bunch of them who appeared to kind of fill that space. But what's happened since then is the people who own the cinemas are yeah, they've shown themselves to be very cautious about what they think audiences will go for. And even the cinemas, they don't want to pay very much. They say they can't pay very much. So the budget for these so-called big budget productions hasn't risen the way everybody thought they would. You know, so with all of these developments and all of this new money flying around and all of these properly capitalist corporations, still the average budget is really, really low. And that's, you know, that's basically, every once in a while there's a blockbuster. More and more, you know, the kind of indie spirited, you know, auteurist films with artistic, you know, higher artistic quality. There are some new sources of possible funding for them. Netflix and Amazon are appearing on the horizon, and they've begun sponsoring films. I mean, this is just beginning, but if you get in with them, that's a very good thing. You know, there's more money from them than you're liable to get pretty much anywhere else, except the very occasional film like The Wedding Party, a blockbuster that, you know, sells 1 million tickets. Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan. Other questions? Do you have other questions, Vincent?
No, it was a very good, very detailed discussion. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you for all the detail, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you very much.
You're very, very welcome.
We're very grateful.
Sure. Pleased to have been with you.
Thank you, Coco. Can you